Hello and welcome to Leviathan News. Today is June 1st. Welcome to summer. And today we have on Dan Elitzer, who is here to talk about a recent article and thread that he published, essentially calling for a new kind of paradigm in DeFi where we don't rely on oracles. So, Dan, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
I'm going to put you in the hot seat over here so we can all talk to you. And so I think it made a bit of a commotion on Twitter after you put it out. It was really interesting to hear about your kind of thoughts in our current state of DeFi, which you say is heavily reliant on oracles. And if we're going to be building these primitives, as we're going to call them, for the future, we need to get to a point where these primitives are governless, non-upgradable, and just they exist in the ether without anybody being able to control it. So, thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me. And I think it might be important to clarify, I don't think that we can move away from DeFi having oracles, period, right? The idea of having a way to get data on chain from the rest of the world that does not exist on chain, that is not going away. What I'm calling for specifically is pulling it out of the lowest level primitives so that you can reduce dependencies there.
Yeah.
And there can be, I guess, more thoughtful selection as to what dependencies you want to bring in and where and how.
Mm-hmm.
So before you get into it, can you just like level set this conversation by defining like what does Oracle mean to you? And like, what does Oracle mean like within the context of this conversation? And like then follow-up question is like, how do you demark the layer of DeFi by which you're speaking about these primitives like being under, and then above that where oracles are more okay?
Yeah, so I would say an oracle is just you can use a protocol service. Basically, it's some method of getting data on chain from the off chain world. And so most frequently that is relating to price data relating to assets that are being traded or being borrowed or loaned. And Chainlink is, by far the leader in this category. That is a pretty narrow use of oracles. That is what we are primarily using them for today. But you can bring in all other sorts of financial data, including things like volatility data. You can start bringing in things like the outcome of sporting events or basically any type of data that you might want. You can bring in via an oracle on chain. There's more general oracles. There's more specific oracles, but
and not to steal your thunder here, but I'm guessing that this doesn't include like structures that we refer to as oracles but are native to the chain. Like I'm thinking like the Uniswap price oracle or
that would I would also say those are they're also, I would say, largely like bad today. You don't want to use those. Because I think one of the reasons why you don't is there's a very strong trade-off, right? When you're using, say, the Uniswap kind of TWAP price oracle, you have to choose, do you want to be very kind of current with your price and have a very short look back window trying to get the most up-to-date price? If you do, it's very easy to manipulate. Or you can have a longer look back window with your Uniswap TWAP, in which case it's much harder to manipulate, but it's more likely to be a stale price. And so if you're trying to do like 50x levered trading on chain, you can't have something that's like, 30 minutes stale as a price, or it's just not going to be a good trading experience. And so while I do really like those and think they'll be increasingly important over time, and those can even be fed into some kind of aggregator type system, for example, what Chainlink uses. But I think over time, we will see more markets where the primary market for that asset is on chain. And then you have smaller kind of secondary markets in off-chain settings on exchanges, et cetera. And at that point, it may become more appropriate to use some of these kind of pure on-chain oracles. because the primary market is the on-chain market. And today, that is true of very, very few assets.
So
yeah,
just
well, it's true. Garrett,
I'm just kind of curious. Curve Finance was doing exponential moving averages for its price oracles to try and get some of the more recent sensitivity along with like long tail of data. Is that an improvement in your mind, or is that still flawed?
There's always trade-offs. I'm not familiar enough with exactly how Curve is doing it. The Curve team is very smart. They've done a lot of very interesting innovations in the space. So I would my default assumption would be like they're doing a good job with it, but I don't know enough to comment on it specifically.
Okay, cool. So like that's like very good just like level setting of what we're talking about. And it's like I'm curious. So like how do we build a DeFi that doesn't rely on like these kinds of systems?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think an important thing is to know that like we already have that for DEXs, right? And so for decentralized exchange, Uniswap is a great example of something that is very much what I call primitive or primitive-like. It doesn't have oracles. There is no upgradability to essentially the core contracts and no governance over them. And I think that is what we want to do, and it's worked very well, right? That is Curve also, largely has an Oracle-free system for the AMM, and so that is also like a very large exchange venue, and so that hasn't been too hard for people to understand. What gets a little more tricky is when you start to look at, okay, how do we do this with borrowing and lending, right? If it's really important that I have an over collateralized loan, then how do I know that this loan is over collateralized if we don't have some reference to some sort of external data source? And there are a number of teams doing this. And to be clear, this is not some idea that like I came up with and I'm like, oh, this would be a great way to do it. The reason that I started writing about it is because I saw multiple teams going down this path because they independently realized some of the both challenges and advantages of taking an Oracle-free approach at the kind of base layer for the protocol that they're building.
So can we take a quick pause here? Garrett, can I ask you, like, we are seeing a lot of new innovation coming out of the Curve USD like borrowing paradigm, but to be clear, that still is based on oracles, right?
So it does have some dependence on oracles. Yes. I think that the oracles though are mostly on-chain oracles. I need to check on that. Or no, the intention is they're on-chain.
I believe it uses a mixture of both on-chain oracles and then the Chainlink together.
So Dan,
to be clear, if you're trying to do a stable coin, you essentially by definition need to have some form of oracle because there's no like native on-chain way to know the price of a dollar.
Yeah, and remember
right?
back in the USDC depeg, we found out quickly which protocols had hard-coded the price of USDC to 1 rather than using a Chainlink USDC oracle. So, like I think it's important to understand before we get deeper into this conversation that essentially what we're talking about is that there are levels of complexity to collateral. So if you're looking at something like ETH, or I guess ETH would be the most basic, right? ETH and WETH, right? These are like governless, non-upgradable collaterals that nobody can really do anything, and you can figure out ways to even have like solid oracles with them. But the question becomes like, once you move into these more derivative-like collateral types, say you're getting like YUSDC or YETH from Yearn, or you want to use like LPs from Curve to then do borrowing lending against, like the complexity and contract risk and the amount of dependencies that you're like signing on to by adding these as collateral types into DeFi, it exponentially increases, and the risks just become a lot more and we start to see some of the issues that you're talking about with oracle risk. So I think that we've kind of figured out this conservative style. Like if you look at what Compound has, right? They only have a few assets that are kind of the base assets for DeFi. But if we want to expand to all these other, yield bearing LSDs, whatever anybody wants to come up with, we're going to have a better way of making sure that those collaterals are the price that they say they are, so that we can ensure DeFi works on top of it.
So you to make sure they are the price they say they are, or you kind of make it so that you don't have to care, right? Or at the protocol level, you don't have to care, right? Individual users care entering and exiting their positions, and you may want to use services to help you manage that. But I think one of the interesting things about these protocols that are designed to be Oracle free at the core protocol level is that it actually takes you down this really interesting design path where once you've said like, well, what can we do? How do we design this so that we don't need to bake in an Oracle for the core protocol to function? Then that lets you get out the idea of governance and needing to permission what assets are being added, because you don't need to think about, okay, what is the Oracle being selected for each individual asset? Can that be gamed? Is it a good Oracle? You're not thinking about things in terms of pooled risk, because I don't think there really is a good way with zero oracles, with zero governance, to do these pooled lending models like what Compound does and like what Aave does. You can recreate it on top of a primitive like this, but it's really hard to do, probably impossible to do that as kind of like a base layer primitive, because inherently, if you're forcing all users to receive the same kind of like risk profile from all the assets being added, you need a governance way to do that. These designs point towards a place where individual users can choose which assets do they want to be exposed to risk from.
So what are we ultimately talking about here? In my head, this like Alchemix falls into this category, right? Where, and essentially how they're able to like build lending without oracles is they like just loan to you in the same denomination as your collateral. So like they don't really care what the price of anything is, because it all like moves together. Is this what we're talking about, or is there even like more complexity and something more interesting here?
I think it's pretty different. I mean, Alchemix still has to care about the relative price, because like there's ALETH, but then if ALETH ends up trading meaningfully below ETH, then that doesn't work, right? Or it violates people's expectation of how those assets should work. And so the Alchemix team has done a lot to try to make sure that these their assets end up being relatively close to the peg for whatever asset they're meant to emulate. So I would say yes and no for that. What we're talking about here generally is like, hey, how can you make it possible for someone to take out a loan against, say, ETH or against an NFT even, and to do that without having some kind of external price feed coming in and saying universally, the protocol believes this asset is this number, worth this number of US dollars. And the answer that a lot of these protocols have come to has been, well, the user is going to say, hey, I'm willing to lend, say, 1,000 USDC against 1 ETH. Or they'll say, actually, I'm willing to lend, 1,600 USDC against 1 ETH. And you can have expiring, perpetual loans, however you want to do it. But fundamentally, then you are saying, what is the collateral factor that you are comfortable lending it at against this asset based on what you believe the price currently is? If the price of that asset then moves in US dollar terms, you are responsible for essentially updating the terms of your loan or doing a new loan under new terms that reflect your view of the riskiness of that asset based on the changed price. But this is, very similar in some ways to Uniswap v3, right? If we think about Uni v3, you have this concentrated liquidity system where you're depositing into different price ticks as an LP. And you can go very narrow and do everything in a single price tick or across a few price ticks, or you can do broad spectrum and like recreate the full spectrum Uni v2. But if you try to go more narrow, you're going to get more fees as a result while trades are happening within your ticks, but it also can move out. And if you want to kind of keep your liquidity around the current price, then you're going to need to manually adjust that, or you use any number of these different services that have cropped up that will automate adjusting your position to kind of keep the current price centered in, or at least within range of the price ticks that you're supplying liquidity into.
So some of the pushback that I saw, particularly from like the Chainlink community, is that it's not oracles ipso facto that are the problem. It's like misuse of oracles. What's your response to that?
Yeah, I would say that, I don't think you can look at anything today and say like, Chainlink failed, and then this money was stolen, and that's not a claim that I'm trying to make. I think that, again, it's the design decisions that you move towards, and we certainly, anytime the oracles have been involved, it generally has been people misconfiguring their oracles, they're relying on bad oracles, or there's issues with the timelines of getting stuff on chain. I think that again, I'm not saying don't use oracles. I think the vast majority of users will end up using oracles in some form or fashion here, not just manually watching things, updating it themselves. I think the main problem is you don't want to create a universal dependency at that base layer that forces everyone to opt into that same view.
I think okay, so at least when I think of shifting any of the risks, right? So if you're shifting the oracle risk away by discharging Chainlink and moving towards a non-oracle system, or an oracle-less system, or like a user-provided oracle-less system, or oracle system, where exactly is that risk getting shifted to? So when you no longer have oracles that you're dependent on, obviously there's some of the risk that somebody's taking. Where would that be?
Yeah, so I think, again, the UniV3 is a great analog here. You can build position management tools on top of UniV3, Chainlink as their oracle. It could be a service that is doing their own oracle feed, and you're relying on them to provide their own view on the price. I think one of the nice things about that, you get a very explicit trade-off between decentralization and centralization and efficiency, right? That's a theme we've seen play out throughout, kind of crypto's entire lifetime. With Chainlink, what they've done very well is kind of create this decentralized, right, permissionless oracle network to pull stuff on chain. And that's great. That's an incredibly hard problem. And they've done a good job addressing that. But when you have to do things in that way, there's a lot of cost involved in doing that to try to get the kind of economic incentives right. And there's, you need to have the right way to essentially get those price updates on chain in a timely manner. And if you have a service, someone might say, hey, actually, for my use case, it doesn't need to be fully permissionless, fully decentralized. And so I'm going to trust someone's got like, a Bloomberg data feed or something, and we're going to use that, and we're going to update based on that. And so again, it's not saying that there's no oracles involved. It's saying that, hey, we're going to actually put them at the service provider layer. And that if, say, one of these goes down, well, okay, you've chosen to use that service that may be going down, but it doesn't fundamentally put the protocol itself in the situation where the protocol can become insolvent and where all of the users end up getting wrecked as a result.
Okay, so you're just shifting. So like when we talk about Aave, right, for example, when we had the CRV sell-off, there was I forget who the actor was, but he was trying to like borrow CRV and sell it and take the price and liquidate Mike's positions that he had, right? And he wasn't able to do this, but
wait, sorry, Sam, do you want to know why you don't remember who it is?
Who was it?
He's in jail.
Oh, it was okay.
Is that known now? Is that a
he was definitely arrested.
I don't know. Definitely arrested.
No, but do we know that was him that was trying? Because that was before he was like on the radar for people.
I don't. I think it was Mango Markets first, then it was the Aave Curve thing.
Oh wow.
Then it was,
okay. My memory of the timeline of those events is not
anyway.
Accurate,
sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, because he got his like $70 or $80 million from the Mango Markets, and then he used that to try to go after Michael.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well.
No, look, Sam, look, to answer your question, I think in my like cynical way is like you're offloading all the risk from the Oracle to like the participants. And you're saying like, well, we trust you to make good decisions. And like, if you, let's say like issue a loan for 1 ETH and you let someone take like, like irresponsible amounts out, like you're the one that's going to eat shit on that. And the protocol is going to be safe. But, that is the difference.
Well, and to be clear, some of them, they'll use different models, right? And so in some cases, you are responsible. In the case of, say, like the Blur's blend protocol, you as the lender are actually responsible for kind of triggering the liquidation. In something like Ajna, there's actually an incentive system where you actually will have keepers who put up bonds and then liquidate. And so there are different ways to approach that. But what's essentially sitting there is you're saying that, okay, we've set the terms, but then in a worst case scenario, what's happening is there's effectively an embedded put option that is being offered by the lender, where they've said, hey, look, worst case, I'm going to take the collateral at this ratio to the quote asset that I've been loaning. And so it's I would say, very consistent with the ethos by which a lot of these crypto systems have been designed, in that it's saying that like, hey, we're going to explicitly spell out what happens in these scenarios, so that saying like, hey, if this doesn't work, if the price moves, if the liquidation fails, worst case scenario, okay, I'm stuck with this collateral. But I think in my view, that's a preferable kind of like failure mode to something where the Oracle price can be manipulated for the entire lending market for all users. You can, force a wick on the price, do a liquidation, to end up with a bunch of users all, being insolvent, essentially the protocol being insolvent, and a bunch of losses that need to be socialized across a wide range of users in a way that's like, that we see it goes to governance, like, okay, what do we do? How are we paying this back? Hopefully you've got an insurance fund. Probably you don't have a big enough one if it's like a major hack like the type that Avi was doing, right? And so it makes it unclear what is the right path for resolving the situation. And I think it's fundamentally better for everyone to like have clear terms coming in as to something goes sideways. How does this get resolved?
So Dan, it's great that you bring up just the optionality of this kind of structure. So what I'm kind of interested in is, what do you think about obviously when you add that optionality and you essentially shift the risk, you're adding a cost that should, in a perfect market be priced in. So what do you think about that, the pricing and how the market will react, or how the market reacts to that shifting cost, that increasing cost between one model to the option model?
Are you talking about like cost of like kind of on-chain operations, or you're talking about like pricing risk? Like what kind of costs are we talking about?
Probably pricing risk. I would think about it in terms of like interest rates almost, where like if you're looking at an Aave ETH loan versus a Ajna ETH loan, like should they be priced the same, or should there be some difference in the risk, or like well, I mean, I understand that
it should obviously be the extra optionality should definitely be priced in, but in terms of how, from a user perspective, this kind of looks, if a user looks at Aave and he looks at the Ajna type loan and they see the increased interest rate, and what do you think the user kind of thinks about that, and is that trade-off worth it?
I don't know that there necessarily will be an increased interest rate. It actually could lead to a lower one. We don't know. We'll see how it plays out. But so one of the interesting things, and I hope I'm okay to share this, but talking with the team at MetaStreet, they've recently introduced and have an alpha their automated tranche maker. So it's a way to do loans against NFTs. And again, this is an Oracle free protocol. And so what they do is you can deposit as a lender into different tranches, and basically say like, how what's the collateral factor that you're kind of lending against effectively with this NFT. And by using these kind of this tranching system, you can have people who will say, I'm going to lend at like a really high LTV ratio. Like I'm going to get to like 95%. And it's like pretty risky if the price of that NFT drops. Or you can have lenders who also say, hey, I really only am comfortable at like a 50% LTV here, 20% even, right? And so what then happens is you get much, much higher interest rate paid to the lenders who are willing to lend at the very high LTV, and the people willing to lend the lower LTV, they're still getting interest, but not as high. And so they're able to like risk select, and the end result, at least in their alpha so far, has been you're having people be able to borrow against their NFTs at a kind of lower cost versus blend, and at a higher LTV, because you've been able to tranche out the risk in this way and say, hey, you want higher returns and higher risk, great. You want lower returns, lower risk, great. By actually allowing both people to lend in this scenario, and to have that tranching, you're actually getting better rates, better essentially capital efficiency for those who want to borrow against their NFTs. So I don't think it is at all a given that by moving to these types of systems, you're going to end up with worse rates for the borrowers.
Yeah, I liked how you said earlier that you essentially talked about it in terms of like a put option, because when we think of money at any level, we're always thinking about like, okay, who's backstopping what when there's a money claim, and whether it's the dollar or ETH in a lending market, or an NFT that someone's borrowing against on Blur, we're constantly thinking about, okay, if when we have to exercise this put option in terms of either liquidation or something else, like who is going to be able to claim, and how are they going to be able to do it, and what are those dependencies that we see there, and in crypto in general, we don't have a lot of the same avenues that you might find if you're at a bank, even though we're building things that look a lot like banks. Like we don't have the same insurance structures there, or derivatives that can help hedge risk. And so I see the importance of building these different structures that can essentially compete in a market to find out which one's best, right? I do worry about that as we get, like, at least seeing how swap aggregation has kind of taken over in the past year. I do think that we're going to see some sort of like lending aggregation at some point in the future. And, for the majority of people who might just want to take a loan, they're going to be trusting the aggregator to make those right decisions for them, to say, put some ETH in and borrow some dollars at the best rate, right? And then the aggregator can go out and split it up and manage it. I don't know what that looks like in wholesale, but the aggregators could shift the dynamics where they set up like fixed tranches into like Aave and Compound just to spread the risk around, when really it just opens up more risk and dependencies on top of them. So
well, I would clarify. I think what you're describing is more of like a kind of borrowing aggregator, right? On the lending aggregator side, like you could kind of view urine vaults, and we've already had these yield aggregators that will split up where they're supplying.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the borrowing aggregators. You're right. We already have like urine, which is able to go in. And
that's the thing with DeFi, right? Is that like borrowing is inherently lending, like that. We don't have uncollateralized loans.
Well.
Well, I mean, not necessarily, right? If you look at like the Maker system, right, with their vaults, your collateral that you're posting there to borrow and Maker is not then being lent out. So you're not.
I know, but just think about it from an aggregator side, right? Like an aggregator UX standpoint, like the transaction is the same. Like you basically need to find like a place to like park your capital. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know. I mean, whatever. It's kind of breaking down. I mean, I think bottom line is like, the reason why we're dependent on oracles is because that's pricing is set off chain. Like basically for every asset that matters, and for every asset that doesn't, it's just the Uniswap like core, like swap like snapshot at that moment. And so I think like that's really like the bigger problem we have, right? Is that like we need markets to be like crypto focused and centered in order to build solutions that aren't reliant on bringing data from the outside world. And I think we're on our way. Like look where we were like 2 years ago, let alone 5 years ago. But right now it's like it is so crazy to really like reckon with the fact that everything that happens on chain from like let's say ETH pricing standpoint is like completely dwarfed just by like Binance alone.
Yeah, so. I mean, I think the Bankless guys pointed out, like I think now the DEX volume is something. It's about like 20% of total like spot volume for crypto, like today versus I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago where it was like sub 1%.
Yeah,
and so we've really come a long way in this direction of having primary markets being on chain. We're not fully there yet. I think we still have a long ways to go, but it is exciting that DeFi has evolved so much over the past few years to the place where it is a noticeable percentage of global spot.
Yeah, and I think I did hear that the former CFTC commissioner on Bankless say that like the reason that all of the institutional stuff are futures and not for like spot Bitcoin is because like in the real world prices are set by futures, not by spot. And so like that for crypto means like, oh my God, now not only do we need to worry about DEX versus centralized exchange volume, but we also need to worry about perp volume as well. But that's like that's like about pricing specifically.
Yeah. I think that's probably a good place to wrap up on. I really enjoyed the conversation, Dan. Yeah, this was
real quick
a great discussion.
Before you go, what's next for Dan Elitzer?
I'll be writing some more pieces in the series, talking about some other ways that I think that we can improve security meaningfully in DeFi. But my full-time thing is running Nascent. So we do early stage venture, focused entirely on crypto. DeFi is a big focus for us. We also run a pretty sizable liquid book in which we're using a lot of DeFi protocols. And so we understand and like feel this problem very viscerally. We want our capital to be safe on chain and to be able to use these protocols. And so we're actively investing in kind of pre-seed and seed stage teams that are working on what we think can be really interesting category defining models that can help push the industry forward.
That's great to hear. We'll have all the links. We have all the links down below. We're excited to see the next stage and next article that you'll be writing about all this. And thank you so much for coming on, Dan.